Okay, here we are. The they go.
I like this one. This was pretty cool. That's my review done. No, I didn't have a lot of like big notes for this one, which was a relief because I know that he was saying like it's gonna get pretty crazy, but it felt like it's like really in this particular section that we chose to read. First off, it wasn't that many pages. I liked this section because it wasn't that many pages. It was really smooth. This was smooth sailing. It was really uh long explanations of somewhat direct ideas at times, but then at other times it kind of tripped me up. And I guess okay, I'll just go to there to where it's kind of tripping me up. Or what I'm not sure I understand. What I'm thinking maybe my understanding of it is just weird and confused. But hi Ed. Um so I thought this reading was broken up into basically a discussion of the who, and then otherness and others, and then solicitude, and then into understanding others in that solicitude, right? And in that transition between solicitude and understanding others in that solicitude, there's this discussion of worldhood, or this reference to worldhood as a referential totality which constitutes signification. So basically, my problems or my confusion starts on page 160 of the Macquarie and Robinson edition. The Macquarie and Robinson, it's page 160 to 162 is where my problems are, or my confusion. But in the Heidegger, that would be page 123. Heidegger 123. And I don't know where in 123, but maybe just a little bit down. There's a part in this paragraph that starts with the world not only frees the ready to hand as entities encountered within the world. Later down in that paragraph, he says, we have interpreted worldhood as that referential totality which constitutes significance, right? Um, I uh First, I mean, I get that. I can understand, yeah, worldhood is a referential totality which constitutes significance. I have some serious questions about that. Because it sounds really similar to an argument made by a guy. I don't remember. There were a bunch of Roberts I had to juggle in my mind. A bunch of different Roberts. Robert Pippin, Robert Brandom, Robert Hartman, and then some fourth Robert, and they were all evil for various reasons. No, it was Robert Solomon, and he was the good one. And there were the four Roberts who were scholars on Hegel. And one of them, Robert, and two of them, Robert Pippin or Brandom, um, talks about intelligibility and this restraining of our uh, discourse to the realm of self-reflective language and thought. And I don't know, that's what that gave me a vibe of, but we can talk about that more. But that's not my problem. Anyway, he says, okay, design is essentially for others, right? That is crazy. In the next paragraph, he says, uh, that starts according to the analysis we have now completed, being with others belongs to the being of Dasein, which is an issue for Dasein in its very being. Thus, as being with, Dasein is essentially for the sake of others. That is also, I mean, I guess as being with, but it is essentially a being with. And so that Dasein is essentially for the sake of others is interesting. Um, but even there, I guess he keeps going basically, uh, and says, and I'm trying to find the exact. Yes, okay. Further down in the paragraph after that, I'm connecting all these phrases to say like there's a general argument that I'm trying to draw a thread, like a line through. Um, and I'm almost done. This is like the third out of the 4 points. The third point is on the next paragraph, somewhere in the middle. This is on Heidegger 124. There's a part that goes, this understanding, like any understanding, is not an acquaintance derived from knowledge about them, but a primordial existential kind of being, which more than anything else makes such knowledge and acquaintance possible. Knowing oneself is grounded in being with, which understands primordially. It operates proximally in accordance with the kind of being which is closest to us, being in the world is being with. Okay, so we've got these are the steps of the argument. Worldhood is a referential totality which constitutes significance. I can kind of understand that. It's like some sort of symbolic network. That makes sense. Dasein is essentially for others. Dasein is a sort of symbol, or insofar as is means anything, it is for others. It's a with others. It's a for others. Sure. And then here, it seems like the claim that's being made is understanding being or knowing oneself, right? Understanding Dasein understanding itself or whatever, uh, is grounded in being with. And so an understanding and in fact, yeah, I think there's yeah. There so basically it's I read it as understanding being is understanding others. Understanding others is understanding being. And this understanding, this sort of understanding of the other, I guess, is that knowledge that he's saying. The knowledge that
Hunter,
makes
I'm lost where you are exactly. In 124, you said
Heidegger
this.
124. Knowing oneself is grounded in being with, which understands primordially.
Where is this?
That's
Oh, I got it. I got it. I got it. I got it.
yeah, it says
Right
yeah.
on, right at the beginning of 124. Okay.
Okay, so is that at the top of the page? Do you have the
Yes.
Heidegger? Okay, so
That'll be the page will break somewhere in that line
at that
probably.
line with the 120. Okay. Thank you, because I haven't known how to point to anything. So at the top of 124, thank you. That's much better. Knowing oneself is grounded in being with, which understands primordial. Oh, okay. So then, if you look at the
Where do you get the
next,
knowing? Where did you get the Dasein is essentially
is essentially for others. That's
no
on
the part where you basically said I think you said knowing oneself is knowing others or something like that.
right.
I'm not sure how you worded it exactly.
Dasign's being all right here. Let me see if this will. And I'm just going to start from a little bit before that start of 124. This will be at the top of the paragraph. Being with is such that the disclosedness of the Dasein with of others belongs to it. This means that because Dasein's being is being with, its understanding of being already implies the understanding of others. This understanding, like any understanding, not an acquaintance derived from knowledge about them, but a primordially existential kind of being, which more than anything else makes such knowledge and acquaintance possible. Knowing oneself is grounded in being with, which understands primordially. So basically, what I'm reading here, and just to put it in explicit terms, is that there is a common positive existential ground of understanding of otherness and self, which grounds and enables acquaintanceship and knowing in a social setting. And if that's weird, and maybe that's wrong, I'm willing to say that's probably completely wrong, because on the very next page he says that can't be true. That can't be the case. And it's on the top of page 125, Heidegger 125. And that's on 162 of the McBrain Robertson, in the middle paragraph on 162. But while these deliberations seem obvious enough, it is easy to see that they have little ground to stand on. The presuppositions which this argument demands, that Dasein's being toward itself is being towards another, fails to hold. And that's basically what that seems. That's the thing that he's saying explicitly. That's not the case. That fails to hold. But I felt. I guess I'm having a hard time distinguishing that Dasein's being toward itself as being towards others, and the previous statement from 124. That's why I'm confused. I'm not saying like, that something is like wrong here, but like I think he's trying to show the difference between those two, between knowing oneself being grounded in being with, and this sort of primordial or common positive existential understanding or knowledge or something. I don't know what it is. And then
Yeah,
not that sort of thing. What do you think? What do you guys think?
so on that very last point, so there's the kind of primordial understanding thing, but let's bracket that out for now. But so that's one kind of sense of understanding that he's talking about. But then for the other one, I think what he's talking about there is he goes into this thing about empathy, and he's talking about a specific idea that relates to that when he's talking about the fact that being towards, where's the actual phrase? Something about being towards.
The being the part of what that you reference on 125, or actually bottom of 124 and the 125, is referencing that prior paragraph, which starts, of course, being towards others is ontologically different from being towards things which are present at hand. And the paragraph before that about empathy is also part of that, I think.
Yeah, but So the
Right.
being towards oneself is different from being towards others. That was the the sentence you were talking about. I think that's how it went, but
Well, I mean, the sentence I'm saying is, yeah, he's denying that. Yeah, he's agreeing with you. He's saying like, yes,
right, yeah,
being towards itself is being towards another. That fails. That's what he's saying. He's like, fuck that. So what he's saying is being towards itself is different from being towards another.
Well,
Being
and
toward, yeah,
the two sentences are quite different, right? One is that the one he's negating there, right, is that Dasein's being towards itself is being towards another. The
right.
one that he's asserting on the prior page is that Dasein's being is being with, its understanding of being already implies the understanding of others. That's a different statement.
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I
Uh,
guess yeah.
okay, so yeah, with the second one, with the empathy idea, what he's talking about there is this idea that you first understand your so you only have this kind of it's the thing that he's always kind of seemingly going against is this sort of Cartesian locked up subject in my own knowing sphere of self. And then through this act of projection of empathy, I then uh, apply through analogy what the other person is feeling. And that's this empathy that he's talking about. So I think that's what he's saying. That's what he's talking about with the it's not first this being you understand yourself, and then from that you use this projective empathic analogy in order to understand the other. So I think that's what he's denying.
Yeah,
With the
that's wrong. You can't do that.
right,
Okay,
right.
so he's criticizing like the social practice while arguing on the prior page, like Deirdre, like you were saying, is a completely different statement. Is he's making an ontological claim about like
It's also
what generates sociability, I guess.
I think it's also the Husserlian idea of empathy. He's rejecting Husserl's idea of empathy, right? Which is this idea
Mhm.
that and the common idea of like putting yourself in another person's shoes, right? It's all of those things together that he's rejecting.
Am I right to think that on the in the second passage he's talking he seems again maybe I'm wrong, but he seems to be talking about actually individuals, like particular individuals, like um like I interact with this other person in this kind of way, and he's like that's not actually how it works. Whereas on the previous page it sounds like he's talking about one of these existential structures, like the being with, that every Dasein is already being with in this social world. And so when he talks about this primordial existential kind of being, because somewhere in here he says, and he said a number of times, these existential structures are not a collection of subjects that then have some sort of relation that becomes sociality, but there is already this primordial existential being with that Dasein. Every Dasein is already that's part of what constitutes the being. So it sounds like to me on that page he's talking about that, whereas on the next page he's talking more about how individual Daseins interact with one another. Is that correct?
Right, yeah. I
No, I
think
think these Dasein still are. I mean, these are individuals, right? In these, if you look at his understanding of a page or two earlier, when he talks about Mitsein and what it entails.
Isn't he talking about those existential structures that constitute Dasein as such?
yeah, and those existentials are not entities or beings.
Right.
Yeah.
But
They
they
are.
are. I think that there is a. They aren't divorced of. Other Daseins who are in the world with you. I mean, they are intimately connected with those, right?
Yeah, so they're kind of
Yeah.
they're determinations of but what is determined is those entities in their being, but that's different from the determination, which would be more the existential structure So that's I mean that's the difference between this primordial understanding, which by the way is something that he talks about in more depth in a few. I think we'll do that in 2 weeks from now. There's this whole kind of section about what exactly that entails, his understanding interpretation thing.
Yeah,
One
and
thing that I think is really interesting here is that, oh, sorry, was somebody else going to speak?
I'm just going to say the understanding there is not, it's not like Kantian understanding in the sense of the categories of the understanding, but it's because he says in that at the very bottom of Heidegger 123 and then top at 124, this understanding, like all understanding, is not a knowledge derived from cognition, but a primordially existential kind of being. And so that understanding is not a cognitive, grasp of a concept. It's a mode of being. And so, and like Chase said, I guess he's going to talk about this more later, but I mean, I think that's another thing to bear in mind. What does he mean by understanding there?
I, I was going to say a couple of things there. One is that it's really, I think it's interesting to me that this is like the only time he ever talks about Mitzvah in all his work. He barely ever references it again. I'm not even sure he ever references it again. I've done several searches through his through German versions of his text and have not come up with much of anything. So he sort of abandons that after this. The other thing is, I think that there's a real. I mean, these things are. I think he's talking about the kind of understanding that you get from literally being with other people, right? The way you sit together and drink beer together and talk philosophy together, the understanding that you get just from quite quite literally being with them, right? It's not like a really fancy. I don't think it's really a fancy idea. Chase, do you disagree?
I do.
Go ahead.
Well,
Disagree.
it was my ontological distinction alarm was going off. Because I don't know, I think Heidegger is still quite Kantian. At least he's doing a kind of transcendental a priori kind of thing, just kind of changing the terms of by which the division occurs. But I think that's fair enough what you're saying, except there's the potential confusion that it would then be talking about, these either objectively present people, individual beings, kind of being together with each other, and then from there you get some kind of constitution of an understanding, where I think he's gonna say it already has to always already there was this understanding, and that's what enabled our particular interactions with each other in that way. So yeah, that's the way I see it, at least.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's okay.
I'm then what is you said there was this prior Chase. I don't want to confuse the terms. I don't know if you said the ontological alarm bell went off in your head, but what is the basis for people being with each other? So you're saying there's something that's a priori about each person before they meet these other people that permits some kind of understanding between them.
Right. That's their
and I'm
being
not
with a capital B or Sein.
I don't know that I'm disputing that, but they have to. There is a. They don't have to actually. I don't know that they. I don't believe they actually have to be together, though he never covers that in here. In a physical sense, he does talk about you can be physically present and not be there can be no mid sign. He doesn't talk about the converse, but I think that there's still a tie to that, a tie to that is included here. I mean, it's in the act of being in each other's presence that it's experienced most fully, I think.
But there, I would have to go see if I could, I think it was in this section where he says that, this being with is an existential constitution of Dasein, or part of that existential constitution, even in the absence of others. So even if there are no others around, nevertheless, that being with is constitutive of what Dasein is. And that being with, like Chase was saying, is a precondition for the possibility of having social relations, for example, or ontic experiences with other people in a social world. But that being with is one of these a priori existential structures of Dasein itself.
That's what I wanted to ask, is if I could use different terminology that isn't Heideggerian, but just to try for me to understand this. I thought when Nevin and you, Chase, were talking earlier, and again, I could be incorrect, but the implication of what you were saying about your understanding of Heidegger's comments made it seem like the implication for me was Heidegger was arguing that intersubjectivity is not possible. That our experience, our existence, our experiences are so unique that we can't be empathetic. We can't really understand somebody else's point of view because simply we haven't lived their life. But if that is incorrect, please tell me, because that sometimes I get this sense from Heidegger in this work occasionally that he's saying, yeah, it's just wherever you're coming from. That's the reality. It's not, you can kid yourself and think that you actually know where somebody else is coming from, but you really can't.
Yeah, I think and I don't think that's a denial of intersubjectivity, though. That's kind of why I argued that there's some. I don't think a lone Dasein in the without the existence of others, in some factical sense, has. Well, I think they become not a Dasein, possibly. But
Well,
we're creating the possibility of being with others, but that being with doesn't mean that you have an understanding of their point of view. That would be a different idea altogether, right?
yeah, I think so. That's mainly about, his critique about empathy, which doesn't really mean that it's impossible for us, that we're locked up in our own, individual uniqueness or whatnot, because he would see that as just the same thing as a kind of Cartesian perspective, where you've got the individual subjectivity kind of first and foremost that's unique, and then there's this problem of how they would interact or whatnot, where he's saying that those need to be reversed, the priority of those, and that first we need to understand kind of same thing about, how do we know the world or whatnot. He's saying instead it's the fact that we're being in the world. It's part of our actual being, and that's what conditions the aspect in which we can actually go out and experience the world in these different particular ways, including in these deficient modes, where then it becomes a kind of intellectual question of, well, how do I really know that the world's out there? Or how do I really know that these other people aren't robots? that have zero consciousness at all. And I'm the only person that has consciousness. In fact, all of you do not exist. I'm a solipsist now. So he would see that as deficient modes of being, or deficient modes of these various existential structures that condition the possibility of both the kind of positive mode and the deficient mode. And that would be, so I think he would probably say that the way that kind of empathy puts it as a question of how can different people know each other, that's something that's legitimate kind of on its own level as a question, but that comes much later and already assumes quite a bit beforehand, just in order to put the question in the fact of kind of individual people and then this relation of knowing between them. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing of an explanation.
It's just that I'm trying to follow his reasoning for that assertion that it's is it because we're all human beings and we have a very broad same experience as finite human beings who have a limited time on the earth? That's the basis. That's the basis for understanding. I don't have to meet somebody to know they're not going to be immortal, right? Right. I don't have to meet every single human being to have a sense of carbon-based life forms, mammalian, resource dependent. So is that what I'm not trying to be sarcastic in saying it that way, but is he saying that it's that broad of a basis for the beginning of us to then, when we interact with each other, to have some kind of understanding of each other?
He uses these examples. Again, I would have to look for the specific passage, but he uses these examples like when I walk out into the world and I see a house, for example, that's not my house, I know that it's somebody's house.
That's like 118 of Heidegger 118, maybe the end of 117, beginning of 118, where he's talking about walking in the fields and walking down by seeing the boats anchored offshore. It's that you're recognizing other Daseins in the world, right? Other Dasein kinds of being in the world.
Even if they're not physically present, but you recognize that these things are an indication of others that have the kind of being that you have. And so I think he thinks these are basic structures of being for Dasein, and because we are all Dasein, we all share these basic structures, and so there's a certain common understanding of this is probably too simplistic, but there's a common understanding of what it means to be in a social world that just comes along with, that's just part of what it means to be this kind of being. It's, so it's not like, with Descartes' view, you get, you might get this impression that you have these isolated individual minds that are completely broken off from one another, and they're stuck to these bodies, and then these bodies have to interact, and then somehow these isolated social minds have to get outside of their enclosed minds, because for Descartes, we are each, the only thing we completely know is our own mental world. And then how do you then account for sociality and for interaction, and how did this whole thing, and I think what Heidegger is saying, that is a fiction. The human existence is never like that. That from the very beginning, Dasein is already in a social world from the very beginning. There is never an isolated, broken individual ego. That's only something you can invent after the fact, when you begin to go through a bunch of abstract thought processes. But that condition never pertains. The one that Descartes describes.
I think that's what he means, but on the bottom of 118, where he talks about that the world of Dasein is a Mitwelt, is a with world. That you just recognize that it's a world of other Dasein as part of the
was part of your being in the world.
yeah. Now I still think that there is an element. I mean, and he goes on and talks about encountering. I mean, there are other Dasein in the world, so you encounter them, and you encounter them in various ways. But one of the ways you encounter them most obviously is when you encounter them um, in in a like within a definite locative space, I think he would say. um,
Or
when you're
within some
physically
like
present
shared
with each other.
project,
When you're,
right?
what's that?
Like within a shared project, essentially, would be another space. Like when you are
Yeah,
immersed in activity together, like a jazz band, it would be a good example. You're immersed within an activity together.
Yeah, yeah, that seems right to me. Okay, so Dasein and its average everydayness, it's absorbed in the world. It's dispersed in its task, which is about this, all the ready to hand equipment kind of stuff. So that's where we normally also we encounter others kind of through the work world, of the environment that's ready to hand and our con getting confused between the different translations, but our concern with it.
everything that we do involves in some way encounters with others, encounters existentially, right? But encountering others in the world,
Even when they're
encountering
not,
their
even if they're
right,
not physically present.
right, encountering the
Yeah, okay.
yeah, I want to say traces, but that's because I'm reading
Trace.
Derrida.
Yeah. I think he does mention traces a few times in here as I think maybe I don't know. But yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, that's more or less how it works.
This is not.
Personally, I find this a very. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just gonna say I have an illustration, but it's not really Heideggerian. It's more Cartesian way, but at least it gets at something like that. Like I'm thinking actually of something Sartre says, but that if you think about the way a child um, matures, the child is never an isolated ego. From the very beginning, when the child begins to develop a sense of self, that sense of self is in relation to, parents and so on. And then as that child continues to mature, that child is then the child in relation to other figures. And, there is just never what the self, well, so I'm using this more Cartesian language than Heideggerian language, but in that more Cartesian language or Sartrean language, the self is never an isolated self. It is constituted by its relations to others in the social world. And so necessarily the maturing ego is never an isolated ego. It is always an ego embedded in the social world. And again, I don't think that's exactly Heideggerian, because Heidegger is trying to avoid these, at least he's trying to make ontology more fundamental than notions of self and consciousness. But at least it's a similar kind of idea that from the very beginning, like as Deirdre Ann said, a recognizable Dasein is always already embedded in this context. And you might have some sort of theoretical person who's raised by wolves or whatever, one of these weird cases where but it's not clear to me that that would be recognizably human. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I just mean if you had some kind of person who was really somehow raised outside a human social context, it's just that person, that being is not recognizably what we are because they don't have those modes in place. And so so every Dasein, every being of this sort is always already from the very beginning in a they world, being with.
No, I think thank you for saying that, Neville, because I think that's very fair. And by definition, right, by the very nature, can I say the word nature? By the very nature of human beings, we really can't be fully human unless we are part of, networks, communities of other human beings. Yeah, yeah.
Everything we do everything we do at all relates in some way to others.
Right.
Yeah, I think that so if you look at the phenomenon of not using phenomenon in the technical sense, of the, children raised by wolves or whatnot, I think you do get a good sense of what he's a contrast, at least, between what he would say is Dasein, because I think he would say to a certain degree, they are not Dasein, but kind of potential Daseins if they're still young enough and have enough kind of plasticity still left. So, I mean, this happens, of course, that children will get whatever left in the woods or something, and they will be more or less raised by wolves, and they're accepted as a pack in the pack, and I think this is kind of something where, okay, well, this is also something of a feature of Dasein to a certain extent, that it can incorporate itself. It's absorbed in the world, incorporates itself in the world, and understands itself in terms of its concern dispersed within the world, which happens to be, the world of the wolf pack for the person who's raised by wolves. But this is something that is going to be different from a kind of human Dasein existence, in that there's no kind of like explicit language is usually one of the main things. So when people are actually, these people that are raised by wolves, when they're kind of taken out of that environment and into the human public world, the thing will be, they usually will hold their bodies in different ways. They do not kind of like walk upright, more or less. Usually they will sometimes will like walk on their hands on fours, and they usually do not have, if they're old enough, they will not usually ever learn how to use language. They'll usually kind of understand like indications, like pointing and things like that, and certain kind of commands, but they won't be able to more or less kind of use it as a function within itself. There's various other things, but I think at least it's a good contrast to see kind of, well, what exactly is Dasein as this distinction, and what happens actually when you don't have, even ontic others around to kind of enforce then this like public world of the Mitwelt, the with world, because I think that would be something like, okay, the person who's raised by wolves, embedded in that environment, the world that they encounter, or that their being is then dispersed within, is a different one, and it's not the with world that Dasein with would be in. So it would still be, of course, the same world in the sense of a kind of objectively present nature world. Of course, that's necessary. Otherwise, how could we interact or whatnot? But yeah, at least it seems to me to illustrate something. But yeah.
This is like my favorite section of anything I've read of Heidegger's. Um, Probably even more than some of the things in the Origin of the Work of Art that I really like. I just think it's a really powerful part because um, you recognize in your being in the world other Daseins through you recognize them through their also interacting with other, their being with others, right? Their being with others is how you recognize these other Dasein kinds of being, because that is how our Dasein kind of being is, um, because Dasein is inherently Mitsein. And there's a few parts in here I don't particularly like where he kind of waxes into or wanes into his um, rustic German village, because he says it's by others. We do not mean everyone else but me, those over whom against the eye stands out. They are rather those from whom, for the most part, this is page 118 towards the bottom, those for whom the most part one does not distinguish oneself, those among whom one is too. That is, I think, not so great. Without that, though, I think that this can be an interesting way to look at radical alterity and Dasein kinds of being who are radically different from us.
Well,
Because in those cases, it's most apparent that empathy doesn't work. I can't put myself in the shoes of a person whose life is so radically different from mine, say a child in Africa, in a rural village in Nigeria, for example. I can't put myself in their shoes. But I think this gives a model for a concept for being with them in the world and recognizing their Dasein nature, which we could interpret as their humanity, right? Heidegger wouldn't like that term, but I think it's a really useful concept in that way, and maybe useful that he never talked about it again because he never really ruined it.
so well, so one thing that I was thinking of when I was just going over this was that in a way there is no real alterity kind of going on with his idea of others, in the sense that the others are Dasein, that we are the others, and it's that they're really. So when he mentions others and he says all these things about others, he's talking about really what Dasein is too, what we are, what I am.
That's a nice way to interpret it. I think that's really I think that's great, and that would work for a way to read him. I don't think that's what he meant. I mean, he's talking about. I'm not talking about everybody. I'm talking about my little German village. But
I thought what he was talking about there was the they, that he was actually, that this was like prefiguring the they, which he's going to talk about a few pages later. Others are rather those from whom mostly one does not distinguish oneself, those among whom one also is. I thought that was a reference to, a sort of introducing the notion of the they before he's gotten there. That
Right.
I am the they in my everydayness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, but that's it. That is what he's saying, that okay, the others, especially, I mean, I wonder if there would be a way of saying that, okay, you can encounter others in a way that isn't in the everyday mode, and then that would be a real kind of alterity relation, maybe. But yeah, I think what he's talking about there with his
And I wasn't suggesting that he's dealing with radical alterity here in any way or attempting to, but that it is a way to, through his discussion of Mitsein and its distinction from empathy, that it becomes a way to talk about radical alterity.
Yeah,
Um,
isn't that what Levinas does? Levinas's whole break from Heidegger is precisely the Mitsein this section, and then being pissed off about not the Nazism and well, the general problems with all of that, considering Levinas is a Jew, and lived through all of that. But yeah, I feel like that's what this is Levinas's leaping point. If I'm correct in my history of philosophy, but that's where you get really, I think, the alterity. That's why that's one of the, I think that's what's going on as far as the alterity goes. Because I don't think you get it in. I want it because I want to agree with Levinas, and so therefore I kind of have to say that Heidegger's not approaching alterity and actually runs from it. If I'm following Levinas to the end.
And again, I wasn't suggesting that Heidegger is here. I think he's setting it up maybe unintentionally.
yeah. I do think the Levinas I think that's a good thing to add in, because I think it is exactly here with this trying to determine what the other is. Although one thing that he says is that this kind of relation with the other is an ethical relation, which is very much opposed to ontology. So he thinks ontology is something completely different, and instead there needs to be this ethical relation of the other, which is then this radical encounter with alterity in the face of the other. Where Heidegger, I'm not sure what he would make of that kind of ethics ontology distinction, but I mean, I know obviously he would disagree with it. But that is I don't know. It's this very, I don't know.
And
Like,
I'm not familiar enough with Levinas to go down to talk about that, but it seems like maybe there is still based on your description of it, that maybe there's even another piece of ground between those. Tristan says we have.
it's good pun.
Yeah.
One thing that interests me about this section, I guess Heidegger in general is at least in the same domain as what you guys are talking about, is that if I understand right, Heidegger insists he's doing only ontology, that there's no ethics here, and yet there seem to be these implicit value judgments here. And even in the vocabulary, I mean, a lot of people have commented that authenticity, inauthenticity sound like value judgments. He insists they're not. They're just these are about ontology, not about value judgments. But in this section especially, I don't know, it's just hard to avoid that sense. Like, this is the end of the first full paragraph on Heidegger 122, which is 119 in the Stambau. He says, so this is the last few sentences of that first full paragraph on Heidegger 122. In this concern, the other can become someone. So he's talking about this, this mode of concern, or I guess solicitude in the other translation, which this extreme mode where you kind of leap in and try to take control of the other. And he says, in this concern, the other can become someone who is dependent and dominated, even if this domination is a tacit one and remains hidden from him. This kind of concern, which does the job and takes away care, is to a large extent determinative for being with another and pertains for the most part to our taking care of things at hand. And so that last thing, pertains for the most part to our taking care of things at hand. If maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but it sounded similar to me, when Kant says one of the ways you violate the categorical imperative is by treating people as if they're things. It sounds like he's saying, well, in this mode, of concern or solicitude, you're doing something for this other person. You're treating them like something that you are manipulating, like you might an object.
I think it's also a mode of when you're treating them, you're not really treating them like other Dasein, right? Say you're in an office and you're trying to get something done, and instead of working together as a team, you're just going about doing things, and kind of a get out of my way kind of a thought process, even if you're not doing that. The way that you're interacting with others. Well, I think I see means to a goal, even when they're not part of that. Even when they're not part of the means to the goal, maybe they are just. It's just that. Well, your relation to, if you go back to the definition of Mitsein, and where he talks about how you can be you can be in the same space with someone and not have and there may not be that withness may not be occurring. You could just be ignoring them because you're trying to focus on your project, right? I think even then you can be doing that.
Yeah, but
so you're trying to get things done.
But my point is, he seems to be making a value judgment here, because he seems to, I don't know, it's very difficult for me to read this paragraph and the next paragraph and not conclude that he much prefers this mode of, he calls leaping ahead. In contrast to this, this is the second full paragraph on Heidegger 122. In contrast to this, there is the possibility of a concern which does not so much leap in for the other as leap ahead of him in his existential potentiality of being, not in order to take care away from him, but rather to authentically give it back as such. This concern, which essentially pertains to authentic care, that is, it pertains to the existence of the other and not to a what, which it takes care of, helps the other to become transparent himself in his care and free for it. So, if you look, I read those two paragraphs, and it seems to me, it's hard for me not to say he's making a value judgment here, that he values this second mode of concern or solicitude as superior to the former, and yet he claims to be describing, if I understand right, describing ontological characteristics without making any value judgments.
I think he's trying to. I agree on the first, but also I think that he is trying to describe how we encounter Dasein and the various ways we can encounter Dasein, because Dasein is so hard for us to obtain any understanding of, that we have to see all these different modes of being, some of which do sound superior to others. But I think he's also recognizing that those aren't necessarily more common. They're just different. They're ways of different modes of interacting, modes of being. I noticed in you're using the Stamba, yeah, and the Macquarie, it doesn't. This care gets used a lot there. Sometimes it's concerned with in the Macquarie. So like where you read this kind of solicitude, I don't know what you read, but that this kind of solicitude pertains essentially to authentic care, that is the existence of the other, not to a what with which he is concerned. And I think you read cares for, and I think that can become a little bit
takes care of.
takes care of. Yeah, and I think that can become a little confusing at times. I think it just means that that there are those interactions with others in which others are just there, right? And that's fundamentally different from the interactions in which we are in which maybe we have sort of a common interest, recognize each other's Daseinness in that.
But I mean, aren't there? Isn't he? I don't know. It sure seems like he's making value judgments here.
Yeah, I mean, I think he definitely is, although it's kind of I understand what he's getting at with the way that he's doing philosophy. You know, he's not explicitly doing ethics or giving, there's no kind of ontology of value that he's doing with his descriptions, but the things he's describing, I think, are, you know, kind of just by the very divisions of ontology. I think it's a question of, can you really do that without adding in some kind of value judgments? I mean, Nietzsche would say no. You know, you're supposedly like indifferent, not indifferent, or but your interpretation of these things, even if you give them in these kind of neutral ontological terms, still, what are we? We're forces. The dominant forces are what give you your value, and that's going to come out in the way that you interpret the world. So I think there's definitely some aspect of that to a certain degree. And then also the fact that kind of even if that wasn't the case, you know, the whole kind of like Nietzschean thing, just the fact that what he's describing, you know, we're so prone to actually give value determinations to it, and I don't think you know, Heidegger would deny that it will. How could you possibly do an ontology without having some aspect that's kind of value laden to some degree? Because I think the so I think, yeah, the section that you're talking about here, I think you can see some of that there, but especially the last section talking about, you know, the dictatorship of Das Man and whatnot, and its inconspicuousness. I don't know. I think it's you have to see some kind of a negative evaluation there to some degree, and if not, then that'd be worrying. In the same way that, okay, Baudrillard also says things like this, that you know, there's no value judgments here. He literally says, you know, it's beyond good and evil. And I to a certain degree, I do think he's right, at least in some of the things he describes, but some of the things he describes is like, you'd have to be really fucked up to not just say like, no, this is terrible. Like, please, no, somebody do something about this.
Well, and I can
And I
see.
think some of the aspects of this, the Das Man and the leveling down of all these possibilities in this public interpretation that determines everything is the same, that, I don't know. I'm against that. I think we should try to turn that in from inconspicuous to conspicuous and try to do something about it. I don't know. Even if just our own like quest for authentic understanding or whatever.
I think
Yeah.
he thinks he's being descriptive. That
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
this is the nature of Dasein's being in the world, and the part of that Mitsein relationship, part of the being with others in the world, is that this occurs. And I think that he thinks that he's not making a normative comment about it so much as just a description of it for the purposes of elucidating what Dasein is. I think it definitely does point to a sort of a goal towards which one could strive, though I think Heidegger might suggest that it would be impossible to get rid of these modes of being. They're not modes of being. We can, maybe our individual Dasein can do something about them. And certainly when you get later on towards, being towards death and stuff, there's obviously, it sounds to me like a personal normative, a personal judgment going on there as to what's the better relationship. But I think that thinks that sort of as part of the structure of Dasein, I think that's why he thinks he's being ontological and not ethical, is that it's part of the structure of Dasein is such that these exist as part of it.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that.
For which a few years later, or like the next year, he becomes a perfect example of.
Yeah. That's another can of worms, because I definitely think, like, how could you read this last section and not be like, how did a Nazi write this? This is like it's a critique of this kind of collectivist, conformist way of the dictatorship of the public. Yeah. And yeah.
Yeah, I forgot which one of you guys made this point. Or I think maybe it was Chase maybe saying you can't really, or I don't remember which one. Anyway, you can't really escape these categories. On the very last page of chapter 4, this is on Heidegger 130, the second to the last paragraph, the last sentence, he says, authentic being of self is not based on an exceptional state of the subject detached from the they, but it is an existential modification of the they as an essential existential. So, like you said, you can't escape this structure of the they. In fact, authenticity is just a modification of it, an existential, a particular modification of it. So, it's
right. Yeah.
You never leave the they.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also, so inauthenticity is really the ontological norm for Dasein. And then authenticity would be this kind of, like you said, the modification of that. Does not rest upon an exceptional condition of the subject. Instead, it's exceptional in the sense that not every Dasein has authenticity. It's something you have to actually earn or construct or whatnot. Yeah, and I definitely think all these things, he's not. Well, actually, I think this kind of relates to last few points, and also some stuff we were talking about a few other weeks. So he's talking about there is some historical variation with the level of, I think he says the how explicit and how conspicuous or inconspicuous the they self is. That for some societies it will be more explicit and obvious, and therefore less controlling, and in other societies it will be more inconspicuous and then therefore all the more controlling. So the fact there is I think that's just a good indication of exactly what he's talking about, where yes, there's this kind of ontological structure, but then you can still have these certain individual, more or less individual, particular variations historically. So yeah, that was quite illustrative for me at least. There's no getting around the structure of it, but you do have some variation within the structure.
I think so. Of all the sections that we've read in this book thus far, this is the one section where I was like, this looks a lot like some of the shit he pulls from German idealism, in particular, like the Fichte lectures. The Fichte lectures. I put my little comment in the bubble for page, from the text I'm pulling this from, but I don't know. It just seems like such a strong smacking of the two. That I just couldn't help but I was thinking about it the entire time I was reading it. Not to say that they're 1-to-1 because they're not. But in particular, with the question about this last bit we've been talking about with the they and the value. The fact that it seems as if there's a value judgments being made in his explication is of existence, his description of Dasein. It reminds me of, I think I'm pulling it from Fichte in my head, but it could be from many of the German idealists. It could be from Kant even. And in this one particularly, it's like it is like the is. It is the is, which produces within us the ought. That kind of the fact that to go back, the fact that there is evil produces the horizon for good, as an intelligible, discrete judgment, to be made. And I think that when he's in here, he's talking about these different modes, these different ways of that Dasein comports itself to the other. Right, I mean that's the wrong word to use, but in that in how it's comporting itself to the other, Dasein could treat the other as something ready to hand, like a hammer, and it is only like that status of is produces the horizon for the ought, that namely that, well, not just that is, but then another is, which is that, the Daseins could just like comport themselves to each other freely, see each other as Daseins, be in reciprocity, so on and so forth. And it's those conditions of is that produce that horizon for an ought, that namely the judgment we make, but that's all secondary to those ontological points. Another one I would say is like, it is, insofar as you have those judgments, it is because you've been with Dasein, you've been in those different modes of Dasein. It's in virtue of you like grasping at those different ways in which Dasein can comport itself to the other. So I don't necessarily think that he's like sneaking in value judgments per se. I don't necessarily think it would follow. Because if that's enough to gotcha, then like we're back to his I think the opening arguments where he talks about circularity. Not to say that he put in value judgments. How can ontology be first? But I think that's kind of in some way he's like, it's almost as if like he doesn't flesh it out well enough, maybe because he doesn't give a shit to talk about it. I think that's a possibility. He just like, that's not something in the beginning he fleshed out the whole circular argument stuff. And then he was like, I'm not even gonna deal with the whole, you're using value judgment terms. I think he's letting that dog lie, to the detriment of the reader, potentially.
This reminds me of sort of naturalistic arguments grounded in human nature, and I do not I'm not saying that Heidegger's asserting something like a human nature, but what it reminds me of is, for example, in Aristotle, Aristotle says, well, this is what a human being is. And if you look at what a human being is, then you can figure out what a human being should do in order to live consistently with what it is to be a human being. I mean, I think that's the essence of his ethics, is living consistently with what it means to be a human being. And he, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he spends several books kind of trying to sketch out what does it mean to be a human being. And then his ethics becomes living consistently with that. And so at least it reminds me of that in a broad sense, in that, like, well, here's Dasein, like you guys are saying, and these are the ontological structures, and there's these different modes, and in some of these modes, Dasein's potentiality is more effectively actualized than it is in others, and then just kind of leaves it there. So, what you going to do? It's like you said, there's so not like saying, hey, you guys, this one's better, but like, kind of like Eric was saying, okay, here's the options. What is it you're going to do now? That's kind of up to you. I could say, oh no, fuck no, I like the they. I love the they. I don't have to make any decisions. I don't have to figure anything out for myself. I can just kind of look around and see what everybody's telling me is the great thing to do and do that. And then I'm cool. It's easy, copacetic. My life is simple.
But I think you can't, I don't know that, I mean, I think we can see that you can make efforts to reduce the influence of the they self to live more authentically in some way, but I don't think we can. I think that Heidegger's saying you can't get rid of those. The they isn't going away, and the they is going to continue to have an effect on you. You're going to, from everything from the movies you watch and the way you dress are all going to be affected by the they, right? Everything is affected by everything about your being in the world is affected by the they. What path you took on the road is to some extent affected by that.
Yeah, I wonder, because so yeah, there's definitely saying that the fact that it's part of the ontological structure of Dasein, it's unavoidable. There's definitely going to be proximally and for the most part, we are dispersed in the they self, and that is our everyday self. And there's no kind of inherent negative valuation by that we're just, oh, you're a piece of shit. Like you're totally stuck in the they self, Like he obviously doesn't want to go that far or whatnot, but I still think there is, um, he's trying to determine these things ontologically in a value-free way. I could definitely see how people would say, well, okay, but yeah, but you're talking about authenticity then as this existential modification of it. Doesn't that have some kind of value to it? Even if the kind of the baseline state is kind of neutral, you can still have a kind of positive value kind of added on top of it, right? I don't know.
To what extent can we? I'm not disagreeing, but I'm wondering to what extent can we, when we don't have direct contact with the nature of Dasein, to what extent can we take control of our own authenticity?
To what
So
extent?
this, oh, sorry, I was gonna say this is another thing I was gonna please Jason follow up, but another thing I was reading, it seemed like there was like some potential grumbles about voluntarism and like givenness going on here. I don't have enough of a fucking clue to articulate what that means, but it rang in my head like that there's like some elements of, to what extent can we be voluntary? Can we go forward and do things? And how much is it just like, hard materialistic givenness? So yeah, that was all I had. That reminded me of that. Sorry.
Yeah, so the first section, which I think is kind of, it tends to get overlooked because I think the other sections are so important and even kind of dramatic. But I think that first section, that I think it's 24. Uh, I think what he's doing there is he's kind of
25,
giving
isn't
you
it?
this critique of givenness. Although I don't think it's quite necessarily like
It's
maybe not in the
25.
sense of the
24 is
voluntarist.
the prior chapter.
Say what?
It's 25, 20, and there's actually a section before
Oh,
25, but it's
yeah.
not part of 24. 24 is in the previous chapter.
Okay,
It's,
yeah, 25, yeah.
So it's 25 in that little chunk in front of it at the beginning of the chapter.
Yeah, so one of the things I've thought that was interesting about that, when he's talking about the givenness and he's saying, okay, even if this is true, this idea of the I is given, it's still not really determinate. There's still something going on that we need to actually have as a, how exactly is the I determined, instead of simply, okay, I've got the cogito, I think determination of some indeterminate being I am. How exactly does that happen? And that uh, is also Kant's critique of Descartes' cogito, is that you need the form of time as the determinable, as this kind of middle term, kind of, in order to go about that.
Well, and you have to sort of turn it into an object too, don't you? That's part of what he's talking about on that first part of 24. Is that we would have to the the I that I am trying to examine would have to become present at hand somehow for me to
Yeah.
examine it, right? I can't examine the I because the I is not an object that I can do that to. He wouldn't use the word object, but you couldn't be present at it can't be present at hand, especially for me. I can't make my own self present at hand. I can attempt to make others present at hand, but really what I'm doing is I'm making their bodies present at hand, right? I'm not making their Dasein present at hand.
Yeah, well, that because he talks about this earlier and makes this point as well. Or not, he makes the same point. When he's talking about, okay, why not talk about subject and consciousness or spirit or whatever? And one of the things that he points out that I think is kind of it's rather, I don't know, good job on Heidegger's part to be able to see this, is that, okay, you can be talking about something that is completely, say, immaterial. I don't want to say spirit because of the connections with Hegel or whatnot, but let's just go with like just pure mind or whatnot. You can still talk about pure mind and it'll still have this very much present at hand, objective presence thing going on with it that's guilty of the same kind of problems of assuming these things as given that you would have as the most kind of naive kind of materialism, like a kind of scientific materialism. So to be able to see that connection between something like a kind of Cartesian mind subject as present at hand, and even if we just want to say it, that's all that's going on, and then the same way that the naive scientist would talk about the person as also this kind of present at hand material thing. So he's saying that it doesn't matter that you'd call it a mind or a spirit or a geist or whatever the hell it is. you're still kind of making the same mistakes as the person who says that, you're just like a clump of matter over there in a location. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, I think at the bottom of or at the beginning of 115, where that's I think the part you were referring to with the given, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I've rewritten that in a I don't remember if I think I went to the rewrote this from the German and the the I tends to deceive us into believing that it's something that this is our root, right? And that the way I rewrote it is the ontically obvious statement that it is which each Dasein is, mustn't deceive to the meaning that it's therefore the way to an ontological interpretation of the unmistakably predetermined given. Kind of puts it into, I think, into a more grammatically English, for me anyway, sentence. That that this the given there is just that this
Well, I think he goes on to kind of question that there even is a givenness in the of it. So he says, well, based off our previous existential analytic of being in the world, there's no goddamn subject isolated from the world or isolated from, in the same way, also, there's no damn subject isolated from others. So I mean, think about, okay, with Descartes and his meditations, he has to kind of go out his way to set up a kind of thought experiment. But at no time is he actually kind of like floating around without a world. And saying that Husserl, when he's bracketing out the world and saying there can be a transcendental ego that constitutes things even if the world is annihilated, still Husserl's just like chilling in his living room. And so that's the point out that, even Descartes with his, wax full of, with his ears full of wax and, blindfolded and, in his jammies, still he's in the world. There's others around. The fact that he's even using language is indicative of the fact that there's other people going on. So yeah, there's no proximate givenness of some kind of isolated subject without a world, and also at the same time without others. Even Descartes or whoever, I don't know, you can say, has there been any kind of like prominent solipsists, like people that really advocate solipsism? They got to be out there somewhere. But even then, like, I don't know, who is the solipsist trying to convince? I don't know. There's still implications of
we don't know them because they're
others
all
around.
analytics.
So even then, the givenness is still, yeah, I was going to say that he kind of plays along with it for a little while. He's like, yeah, there's a givenness of the I, but then he's like, okay, but that's nothing at all like this mere formal reflective awareness of the I. And then why does that mean that we have to then abstract it from the world and others? It's like there's like one givenness of the I as this ontically obvious thing that we then have to, why is it that we have to take that and then isolate that, even in our thought experiments? Why? So that's, yeah, just another thing where he's going off on Descartes, who he obviously hates, but yeah.
I think you could say even, when Descartes doubts the existence of the world and he says, okay, I'm just a thinking thing, which is just a thing that has thoughts. But then if you look at the constitution of those thoughts, I mean, I think what Heidegger would say is Well, let's say that that's what you've done, but look at how your thoughts are constituted in this isolated thinking thing. These thoughts themselves are full, chock full of others. You know, you think you're this isolated individual, but everything that's, you know, like all these thoughts that are rolling around in your thinking thing, they are not the kind of thoughts that an isolated entity could have. You know, and because so even what's in the thinking thing is, you know, as Heidegger would say, always already embedded in this, you know, this being with others. So yeah, so even in his isolation, he's not isolated.
Yeah, the fact that you can even think at all in a way where there's sense of, you know, this is connected with the way that grammar is constructed with, and that is going to be dependent on the language you're actually using. And even then there's variations of it. Yeah. How many, it's not like somebody just makes up the words as they're thinking and that they're all like constructed by the person. That would make no sense. And language is exactly the thing. It needs some kind of generic commonality for communication, or you know, however you want to theorize about language, you have to have that. Otherwise, what the hell is the point of it? Like I'm just gonna like talk to myself with the language that I make up. Yeah, language seems to me to be one of these things that I don't know if Heidegger ever actually makes this point. I guess I've never actually read, he talks about language more in a later section, and I've never actually read that part, so maybe he does talk about this, but it seems like something that is definitely a mit sein, Dasein with kind of thing going on. Language, I don't know how you can possibly have it without having others, you know, just full of it.
You know, another, so thinking about Descartes again, you know, he gets to the point where he says, well, he has to get God back, and then once he gets God, then he can say, okay, now I can know math and geometry. And so all I know is that I am a thinking thing, God exists, and math and geometry are reliable. But math and geometry, even if, I mean, you know, they are, you could say they're language independent in a way, in that even if they are eternal truths, but any expression, so any thought that he has, like 2 + 3 = 5, he's employing a particular symbol system to represent mathematical concepts, and that symbol system is not a private language that he invented. I mean, I don't think, my guess is it's not possible to think, to even think abstract mathematics without using a symbol system that was generated in a social context. So even this extreme, you know, this effort to try to encounter something that really is something you can know in your isolated intellect for sure, is dependent on a system of symbols that was generated in a in a social context. So even that, you know, the others are there in his mathematical analysis even.
Yeah, I mean, the person raised by wolves isn't going around doing geometry with the wolves. Uh,
I actually had a thought about that a second ago. I don't even, I think that, so this is not a general comment against anyone in the group here, but it's a sensation of mine, and that's that, like, the feral child has become, for contemporary philosophers, like the native savage in some regard. Like it's like, you know, the humanoid thing over there, which possibly has the ability to be like brought into, you know, it contains something, but there's some insufficiency in its past which prevents it from getting that. I'm not saying anyone's here is calling feral children savages or using that, but I have a deepening suspicion for that, with primarily analytically driven folks. It's like their new crutch, along with like zombies. But that comment aside, but I would venture to even say that like the feral child for Heidegger, even if we take this feral child really seriously, it you know, I think that it too is it's docile. It falls in the same camp. Like I don't know, maybe its inability to grasp language is whatever, but I still think that it falls within the docile area in that you know if we go childhood psychology development and whatnot. I mean, it has to be at something's teat for long enough, you know, to be able to get to the running around as like a toddler form Tarzan. Um, and so yeah, I don't even know. Like I part of me thinks that Tarzan is Dasein, precisely because I mean they made it work in the movie, right? But I I think that I would say like I'd venture to even say I don't know maybe I want to say like Tarzan still has the ability to be Dasein, even if the other for which he has there is just something that appears to him to be something like a Dasein in that it has self-concern and it's a troop, blah blah blah. I don't know. I kind of want to think like Tarzan as our symbol of feral child gets to be Dasein.
So I don't know if I've ever actually watched. Okay, I know I think the original Disney Tarzan. I think I watched that or whatever. I don't think it's actually called Tarzan, right? Something else. But so yeah, I guess it seems to be what you're saying. Okay, would it be that the feral child is more a deficient mode of kind of these existential structures of Dasein that we're talking about? Which I could see that in terms of a lot of cases, but I think there's some cases where, especially if it occurred when the child was still really young, where they adapt to some other milieu, some other Umwelt, Heidegger would more want to use that, uh, to the point where you lose then the possibility of kind of being integrated then into this public world of everyday Dasein. In which case, it seems like that would probably be at least this is one interpretation. You could say that that is the point where there's a cutoff from Dasein. Um, I don't,
I'm just thinking about like if I gave like a 14th century peasant talkies, you know what I mean? Like that's the kind of vibe, you know what I mean? Like its Umwelt is so their Umwelt so massively different. And it's not necessarily that like they're incapable of being of getting to being within our Umwelt or something like that. But I don't know, I think maybe like even to go back to the child thing, I think that like I think with the child the thing we have to keep in mind is like the like I guess the what was the earlier the control that we brought up talking about so involved in the day that it's a you used a word it's in well I guess what I'm trying to say is that like they're so damn traumatized that that's what's going on to be able to be a feral child in that position there has to be some intense traumatic pressure exerted and that is what prevents that's the preventing aspect their thrownness is so thrown into the trauma I guess would be my speculation my armchair psychoanalyst interpretation over here.
There
Is it
was
really?
there was a case of a child in France. He was actually in France, and I don't know if his parents died when he was 4, but there actually was a recorded instance where people tried to deal with this child when he was older, I don't know, 10, 11, 12, And I don't know how he was able to live, get sustenance, but it wasn't like he was raised by wolves. This is not the Jungle Book in Bordeaux, but it was actually a situation where maybe it was a smaller town or a village, but his parents died or whatever. He was able to sustain himself, but because he didn't interact with people, he forgot any language he had as a young child of 2, 3, 4. And when people tried to socialize him, to educate him, to provide him language, there was a very, very real ceiling barrier on his ability to interact with them.
Yeah, is it's so from a kind of scientific perspective,
Neuroplasticity, it's got to use it or lose it. So babies have more neural connections than adults do. It's this kind of filtering process based off of use. So you have to kind of force babies to, force them, to use language, encourage them is probably the better word. And then they're kind of the potentiality that's already inherent.
They model it, right? They have to model it. It's not that you don't have to do anything to get them to talk, but except be around them.
No,
You
yeah,
have to be
exactly.
talking around
Yeah,
them.
they'll naturally do that.
But I think that's the thing, though, is that it's that they have to be in these relationships with other people. It's not that, and I think that's the key piece here with all of these examples is, do they have Dasein? Well, are they able to exist within these structures of Dasein? Do they have these structures of Dasein apparent in them? If we encountered them in the world, would we recognize them as Dasein kinds of being who are with us in the world? And would they do the same? And if the answer is no, then they don't. Then one of us isn't Dasein.
I wonder what like a Heideggerian child development or what would his account of child development be like? Is an infant Dasein? Like an infant that was just born. Seems like it seems kind of absurd to say that, well, that's not Dasein. Especially if he's still kind of connecting it with humans, obviously. But I don't know. So one thing I was thinking about with kind of this thing where I was trying to at least establish a interpretation where you could have this demarcation of the feral child becomes no longer Dasein, that this would at least enable you to think that Dasein isn't just simply okay, is it an anatomical human or is it not? Is it obviously it's still part of the human species, a feral child that becomes an adult that, can't use language or whatnot. But if we think that, Dasein is different from just simply the predicate of you belong to the species human, then I think this is maybe one place for that. But also, the other thing I was thinking about is if there's something like a normative, a kind of crypto normativity going on, then it's with this designation of you belong to the human or you don't. And I think, later Heidegger, of course, tries to kind of get outside of this humanism that he says is kind of inherent with the whole way that the existential analytic is centered on Dasein. But I think this is a good place to see that, okay, there is some kind of crypto normativity going on with you belong to the human specifically. Because that's, the designation of human or not human has kind of always been something like that. Maybe not like explicitly ethical kind of thing, but definitely a kind of political, I would say, political structure of some type uses that binary designation of human, non-human in order to further its interest in some ways, I guess. Um, but so I'm trying to suppress this so one thing that's also interesting is with the feral child thing, the fact that we have a tendency to interpret it, within this value language, I think is already indicative of the fact that there is some kind of crypto normativity kind of going on with that. But the thing I'm trying to suppress is so Deleuze and Guattari, they talk about feral children and whatnot, and if anything, they're going to give a positive evaluation to the feral child for exactly escaping the kind of they self generic public interpretation. Because they would say, yeah, like an ability to escape from something like that. That's probably a better model for this kind of Spinozist ethics that they want to more or less talk about, than the designation of, feral feral child, you're not human, that's bad. If anything, they want to do the opposite, although it's more subtle than that. They don't simply say like, yeah, feral children, awesome. Go throw your kid in the woods, No. But still, interesting points, yeah.
Well, you were talking about Chase about the binary human not human, but if you look at I one of my fields was anthropology as a graduate student. It seems like it is very, very common. You don't have to wait until the collision of Europe. Well, it wasn't really a collision; they went there, but European interactions with non-Europeans to get this sense of us them, right? I mean, you can look at so many traditional societies, cultures. I'm trying to think of a more neutral term where within the group, however defined, clan, extended family, band, group, there is, for lack of a better term, ethical code. One should not steal from another, right? One should not lie to another. But when it comes to the other, those people who are not part of our group, all bets are off. Of course, you can steal from them. And that seems to be replicated many, many times in different human cultures. I mean, just even think in the English language, the root word of stranger is strange. The root word of foreigner is foreign. There's this sense of us versus them and what we are. And that's even in popular culture. Remember in the movie Avatar, how was the word Navi translated? The people. And in many human linguistic groups, the term for themselves will be translated as people or the people, and they will not use that designation for others. And so I'm not saying that makes European imperialism a-okay. It doesn't. But what I'm saying is there seems to be something very docile, very something inherent in human beings as human beings, regardless of linguistics, religion, level of material development that replicates. I don't want to say replicates itself because that makes it sound like a hunting gathering society in Brazil is somehow connected to Nazi Germany. I'm not saying that, but it seems like it's been. You can find it in vast different areas on the earth at different times.
Yeah, I agree with that. So to knock this off my bingo card, I'll say Bergson's account of society is pretty. There's necessarily kind of like, okay, there's two tendencies. There's a tendency towards closure and a tendency towards openness. And you'd say that there's necessarily some kind of structure of exclusion that kind of goes along to give any kind of society this sense of being a closed enough in order to have at least some kind of like identity of itself of where this people or that people. Um, Even if it's yeah, but obviously there's tons of variety in the way that can come about. But yeah, I think that's a pretty good point. I forgot. Oh yeah. Uh, the other thing I was thinking about was so the I remember Deirdre, you said that you thought people was a better translation of Das Mann than the they self or the they. And I was thinking that I think that goes into how there is this kind of humanistic element to it. And I think that's also part of the, okay, the way that Heidegger talks about Das Mann is very much that's establishing the normative structures, the values. So he says that explicitly. Uh,
You
that
must
it's
be drawing
establishing
back to
those.
when we were in contemporary continental, because I only vaguely remember having said that.
Oh, you said it. Oh, I guess maybe the last time you participated in one
Did
of
I?
the,
Did I say people then? Okay.
yeah, I think so. Yeah. Um, but I mean, it makes sense, especially if you think about, okay, Dasman, means the one. And he's using this way of saying, one does this, one doesn't do that.
Yeah,
That,
it's hard to say the one because you don't that the one doesn't make sense in that way in English. You could say it in French maybe, but it'd be like
yeah.
all right? It
Yeah.
wouldn't
And
be
that is kind of like that is sort of like it, like that's usually seen as the informal we. But then really, I think you could also say really what he's getting at that's closer to the uh one does, one does not would be something like il faut or il ne
I,
faut
I
pas.
I do think the we is closer than the they. I think it's a better. I think if you said the we, you'd be far better off than the they. You still aren't getting it,
Yeah,
but
this
you're
I mean,
getting
well,
a lot closer.
Dasein is the we. I think that makes a lot more sense that it has this kind of because the they sounds like something where it's kind of like that's not you, that's they. Where
Right.
it
It's
makes
sort of
more
like
sense
this
to
is more like the we self as opposed to the I self makes a lot more sense. It's the
yeah,
it's
definitely.
the
Yeah.
group talking. It's the group talking, but the group that I'm part of.
Yeah. That that's a really why don't
I have a
people make
really
that point more? That seems really obvious to me now.
so on that, like when he introduces the they, I think he calls like a neutered. He like uses he says like a neutered, and so I was just think like,
No,
interesting.
it's just it's a Das Man is it's that's the man there is because it's I mean what do you mean by a
I was
neutered?
Well,
just
Is
I
he
was
using
just gonna
that's what
say
Das?
Heidegger says when
He specifically mentions it being neutered?
yeah,
yeah, yeah. In the text, he
Oh.
I
let me
forget where at in
let
the
me
text,
find
but
it.
like he
But
neutered
that
he
version of man doesn't even have a normally doesn't even have a
Yeah, here
that's
it
his
is.
that
they
Okay,
is
so it's
his they is neutered, a neutered they, and so I was just gonna come in here and be like this is an interesting. I could see some undergrad pulling like a paper about the like gender, sexual body politics potentially of like Heidegger's neutered they. Because it's I mean it seemed like a very strong. I can't find it right now, but
so it's 126 for the German,
okay. Yeah, but I
kind of
mean that
towards the end.
is I mean I guess maybe, but he's making the word is essentially being he's essentially making it up as a Dasman because there's not a that's not a I'm not aware of that word being used in German elsewhere.
So
Man, like a
well,
man, like the masculine is MANN, double N at the end. That would be
Right.
der Mann, right? So man is usually lowercase. It's usually not a noun. It's a pronoun, but it's the word that we would say one. The pronoun one.
Right.
So
Well, okay,
I mean, I just don't see it as being particularly, I guess, because he's not pluralizing it. So he's not saying demon, which would seem like maybe what he should do. That's another reason, though, that they doesn't work because it's not plural. I
hmm
mean, it is, but it's not. It's not using a plural pronoun, plural article.
So I think
It's a weird word.
so when he says, the who is the neuter, the they, das Mann. So that neuter, I think it's important to remember. So German has three grammatical genders, you know, masculine, feminine, neuter. So I think he's pointing to the grammatical gender neuter to indicate das Mann, and I think even das is the article used for the neuter, I think, anyways.
Right.
Yeah, and then but then within the context of that, the whole paragraph, he's trying to indicate that it's not any kind of a particular other or self or anything like that. Instead, it's more this kind of, I don't know, background structure that we belong to.
So das is common for certain types of well, like it's das beer. It's for like liquids are usually das's, and things that are singular groupings like that. I think that's what he's
Ish.
kind of getting at. I don't think I don't think that there is I mean, these are grammatical genders, and I think in German, grammatical gender is a lot more obviously grammatical. Not it's in
Yeah, I
English.
think so
It's in
too.
it's in English that it becomes confusing because we only gender pronouns. So,
Yeah, exactly.
um,
That's why I mentioned that. Yeah.
yeah, but because all words have a gender in German, um, then because the neuter is a gender in the German system, because all words have a gender, it has nothing really to do with it. I think he's saying the whole purpose of him saying that it's the neuter there is to say that it's not the me, right? So like for
Yeah,
someone who
yeah. It's
doesn't
not. It's
for someone
not.
of course in my case where I use they them it's kind of but for someone who doesn't use for someone who uses for someone who uses masculine or feminine pronouns to describe themselves, um it's they would normally, if they were referring to themselves but calling themselves one, and they were for some reason making it into a noun form, then it would be gendered like they were normally. Um,
Yeah, I
I was
think
just. I was just trying. I was just remarking about the more along the lines that the ambiguity of the translation lends itself to that kind of like bad undergraduate paper
oh, yeah.
of, that like takes like something like that and then just like runs with it. But it's like interesting. It was probably really fun for that undergraduate to write, but it was just like based on like a very acceptable like lack of just like experience working with translated text.
Like nice paper. I suggest your next class be linguistics.
yeah, just get on the Duolingo for German, and you'll quickly have to realize, like, oh God, what grammatical gender? Oh my
Yeah,
God,
no, I think
like
that there's
language
still
is
so
hard
much.
enough.
Yeah, but I
Rather
think
be a
even
feral
among
child. I don't know.
but I think, people can study foreign languages all day long and still not understand grammatical gender that for the most part, grammatical gender probably predates
So in
concepts
that case,
of
it would be because it's
of
too near to
sexual
them.
dimorphism in
It's
that sense, right?
inconspicuous at that point. So all the more dominant. Where for us, it's kind of like this strange thing where like grammatical gender. I mean, it's obviously not like a difficult concept to grasp, although it's still the fact that we don't have it. So then the fact that we then apply instead other form, we can't understand grammatical gender as this kind of baseline structure, I think, that I think Heidegger is indicating, at least with that passage right there.
It's extremely challenging for Americans even who understand like you go to Germany and to have to see a baby and have to ask essentially, the literal translation is how old is it? Like, to say to say it to about a baby.
Isn't
But
oh
you
yeah,
may even
isn't
know that it's a boy or a girl, for example, and that everyone is calling would refer to it as a boy or a girl. People may have referred to the child as a boy or a girl. If it's a baby, it's a das. If it's a young girl, it's a das.
yeah, exactly. Das Mädchen,
Yeah.
neuter. So even literally the word girl is neuter. So
Can you
I
turn off
think
the
that
recording, Nevitt?
Sure.
If you're gonna